Thank you so much, David, and everyone for being here. We're going to start right away and turn the lights off. That'll be more comfortable, won't it? um, so let me forward here. We can turn the lights down, please. Anyone in charge of the lights? Great. I'm going to start out. David mentioned that this is an ongoing body of work. It's been quite a long time in the making. I'm currently working on a book, and the goal was 100 images to edit to 80 for a book, and I'm at about number 75. So this next year, these last couple of years have been the last chapter of the book. I'm showing you these two slides because I just want to introduce you to the project. The first part of the project was a huge installation piece that were images printed on chiffon that you traveled through, journeyed, walked through. They flowed in the wind. And then the image on the right is the more current work, which I call print work. Each image was designed as a separate narrative. I'm going to start by first, before we talk about the project at all, I'm going to introduce the project with a video piece that was shot for Expo in New York, and it was shown at the Javits Center, and it's actually a product endorsement. I'm not trying to sell anyone paper, but it's a really great way to see how I work in the studio with a nice introduction about the work. So it'll be a couple minutes, and that'll kind of give you a good intro to it. Oh, nope, sorry. This whole project, I was going to do this one introduction slide. This whole project is based on the premise of two items. The first one is personal experience, is that when I was a child, whenever my mother would wake me, I always would tell her that I went somewhere at night, and she would quiz me about where I went at night. And I had always this notion that we leave our bedrooms and go different places throughout the night. And my journey through this project was really related way back to that childhood experience that complemented with the research I did in the sleep laboratory on REM sleep. If you're awoken from REM sleep, you have very vivid recall of your dreams. And that's what took me to the sleep lab. Now the video. Oh, this is when I moved back and forth here a couple times. Sorry. Nope.
Susan K. Grant's Night Journey examines the perceptual and psychological aspects of the dream state and provides pictorial access to dreams, memory, and the unconscious. The series, which combines art and science, consists of a suite of lushly printed black and white digital prints and a room-sized installation. To create the work, Grant photographed shadows of models and props in her Dallas studio using a 4x5 view camera and a digital leaf bag, then prints the images on on-wall fine art paper.
Using the shadow as a metaphor, I create images that portray a sense of surprise and wonder. These works oftentimes conjure up childhood imaginings, fairy tales, and nightmares. By using mythic characters and ambiguous objects, I delve into the fantastic to create phantom-like tableaus. These tableaus capture lost and forgotten fragments of experience and emotion. This project is a culmination of REM sleep research conducted at the Southwestern Medical Center Sleep Laboratory in collaboration with sleep scientist Dr. John Herman. Using myself as subject, I was tape recorded in the laboratory on many occasions while awakened from REM sleep. Audio recordings captured in the laboratory served as inspiration to fabricate the images. The images in the Night Journey series are printed on Honolulu fine art paper. I love Honolulu because they've been producing an impressive variety of museum quality papers for over 400 years, and they're made out of 100% cotton or pure alpha cellulose. As an early adopter of digital technologies with a background in book art and paper making, I fell in love with using cotton paper storage printing. Honolulu Photo Ray is my paper of choice. I'm in love with the lush surface and the substantial weight of this paper. It captures the subtle tonalities with precision to detail and an amazingly impressive depth. The Night Journey images printed on Honolulu are seductive to look at. The large expanses of black in my shadow images look almost like velvet, and the tonal range perfectly illuminates the emotional quality of the dream state. To me, the print surface of photo is just stunningly beautiful.
Okay, that's my advertising. Sorry about that. What I'd like to do next is I'm going to, the beginning of this presentation, I'm just going to show you a little bit of the technical process, how the lab worked, and also how I went from the lab into the studio. Jerry, you have reserved seats up here if you want to come in. Yeah, there's two. One of our guests is standing at the back, and we have reserved seats for him. So I would show up at the laboratory about 2 hours before bedtime, and the scientists that I worked with had done a lot of research with REM sleep awakenings, and what they would do is measure different areas on my head in order to figure out where to attach electrodes. I'm going to go through these slides very quickly. So this is the left eye, right eye electrodes. So what's happening is they're connecting electrodes so that they can wake me in the middle of the night out of a REM sleep. You'll notice in the background this very old-fashioned machine that actually would record these different REM sleep awakenings. And they don't use this technology anymore. And on one of my visits to the lab, I noticed that it was in the back room. And I didn't really know when I started the project what the end result was going to be. And I wanted those old-fashioned REM maps. They're not called REM maps, that's what I call them. But so they would hook me up with all different electrodes. And if you really know the science of sleep, all I really needed was the left eye, right eye in order to see a REM awakening. But I wanted as much graph material on those graph charts because I thought I might use those to wallpaper the walls of the installation later. So every place that you see an electrode is going to be connected to one of the bars on the line. And here I am ready to go to sleep, right? Oh, thank you. So if you look here, this is the left eye, right eye. This one here is probably the most uncomfortable, and that's breathing. We also have some breathing electrodes here, one at the top and then at the base of my skull. And then from there, I would go down to the bedroom. And I slept in a specific sleep lab, and it wasn't a lab for artists. It was a lab that they were doing scientific research on. And I got several grants in order to sleep in the lab. And I would go down the hall to the bedroom, and this is one of our graduate student assistants. And there's a little electrode box. Every electrode that's on me is connected into that box. You'll see above me a very fancy microphone. My husband is a sound artist in one of his trades, and we were recording DAT recording because we wanted really high quality audio. Because again, I wasn't sure how I would use the audio or the visuals later. And the way that these bedrooms are hooked up, there's actually a loudspeaker in the ceiling. So they would wake me over a loudspeaker, and then I would answer their questions into my own microphone. I also recorded infrared video footage, which I have still not done anything with. And I have sort of an idea for the infrared. I just wasn't sure. I wasn't sure how to use it. But as an artist, I wanted to capture as much data as possible to use as inspiration later to create the project. So here, once I'm hooked up, this is Dr. Herman. I have another picture in a minute. We can see him. They're adjusting all the dials to make sure that every one of the little inkjet, they're not really inkjets, but they want to make sure all the little jets are firing. And then what they do is they sit and they wait, and they wait, and they wait, and they wait. And if you want to know a little bit more about REM sleep, everyone in this room has a REM sleep. It's normally every 90 to 120 minutes a night. And that's where most people could start if you didn't have someone watching you. So they're actually watching, and what they're watching are these lines. This top line and the top two lines are left eye, right eye. And there's really nothing happening. There's no movement there. This is heartbeat. This one here is an interesting to watch because that was that electrode that's right below my chin. And most people can tell you that, and you probably all had this experience when you're drifting off trying to read a book and you nod off. That's that last muscle that's giving way. And a lot of scientists believe that when you go into a deep sleep like that, you're actually paralyzed from the waist down or neck down. And that's that last muscle that they can really tell that you're in a deep sleep. So this is what they would actually look for. This is a REM. This is a map just before REM sleep. Actually, this is a REM sleep right here. It would be. This would have been a straight line a minute ago. So they're watching. They're also doing it digitally, but they're watching on the monitor and watching on the pen plotter. To wake someone out of a REM sleep, you want what looks like this real beautiful sawtooth. That you can see that the left eye, right eye, they're kind of moving together, but they're also really far apart. So if we watch this muscle right here, I'm deep in sleep, and a good REM awakener will let me REM for a little while and then wake me at just the right time, which there's no scientific right time, but they'll watch that for a while. So notice this right here, they've just awakened me right here, and I'm talking, I'm reciting what the dream was that they woke me out of. And you can see that everything changes because now you're not in a sleep state. You'll notice at the top of each one of these little charts is a number, and as I went back and transcribed all these audio recordings, I would put a little yellow post-it that had to do with what was occurring at that moment. At some point, I thought I would use these REM maps with the images, which I didn't, but I thought it was at the time. So they'll watch, and as soon as I'm in a REM like that, we had a series of different graduate students that we trained in a number of awakening methodologies, which John Herman designed. And what I was most interested in the project was I was really interested in capturing what the dream state looked like. I didn't care what the dream meant at the time. I just wanted to see what it looked like. And so they would ask me a series of questions that would elicit visual feedback. First thing they would do over the loudspeaker, and remember I'm in a pitch black room, right? They would say something like, what was the last thing you saw before we called your name? And then I would say what I saw, and then we would work the dreams backwards. For example, what happened before that? What happened before that? What did it look like? What color was it? How many people are there? Is it black? Is it white? What's the lighting like, etc.? And those are called interrogation sessions. It's not my terminology, it's the lab terminology. And those could last anywhere from 20 minutes to 45, depending on how much memory I had. The next thing that I did, in my life as an artist, I've always been very inspired by written text on page. And I like to read and get visual pictures in my mind of what I'm reading or what I'm imagining. And I wanted to use that same methodology with the work itself, is that I would then transcribe. I sent all of the tapes, audio tapes, to a transcriber, and she put everything into written text. The first problem is everything's backwards, so the dreams are backwards, right? So I took all the written text and then put them back in reverse chronological order so that I could sort of make sense of what the dreams were like. And I know that this isn't very sharp, and I'm not really showing you this so that you can read what the transcripts look like. I do want to here, which was really crucial, a pivotal point in the project. I think I told you in the beginning I had no idea how I was going to use the research. I didn't know what the imagery would look like. At some point, I knew that I wanted to make an installation piece that was based on the experience of dreaming. I wanted the viewer to feel as if they walked into a dream space as opposed to looking at any one image that was a significant illustration of any one dream. It would be much like going to the Grand Canyon and never taking a picture of the Grand Canyon and then coming back and making a whole entire body of work about the experience of the Grand Canyon. That's really the best analogy that I might give. So transcripts, I come across this. This is my describe the branches to me, or the interviewer say the branches are black, almost silhouette outlines. There are no leaves on the trees or buds on the trees. Map would look, or blood vessels on your skin would look. So I'm looking now through all of these transcripts for visual pictures of how I might create this work. At some point in reading about this silhouette, it struck with me the idea of when the lights went off in that pitch black room, there was this after effect in my mind of what I had just seen in the room. If you open and close your eyes right now really fast, you can kind of see that outline of what I'm talking about. And so reading this notion about the idea of the silhouette and then this after effect, I mentioned that when you're woken out of REM sleep, your dream, what you're in the middle of a dream is just very, very vivid, but it dissipates as quickly as it is vivid. So the notion of using the shadow to me was a perfect metaphor in that the shadow is there in 1 minute. When we turn, it's gone. When the light changes, it's also totally gone. So that was really the inspiration of coming up with this notion of using the shadow as the metaphor. These are some silly little sheets that and I guess they're not really silly, but I always make these. It's the phrase in the dream that I'm interested in working on. Mood or description of the general topic I'm going to use. Talent is needed. In the photo world, we call our models talent. Then I also made these sheets that were pretty thorough reproductions of the phrases that I thought I wanted to use as inspiration to begin making imagery. Then the next thing I did is I settled upon this notion that I was going to photograph the shadow as the project. And I began working in the studio. You'll notice in some of the images, there's quite a good, beautiful, what I think of as beautiful distortion within the images. The distortion physically is caused because of the way my backdrop is set up, but also psychologically and philosophically, it had to do with reading through the transcripts. There were many transcripts that would read, when I would describe what the dream looked like, there were areas that were distorted, but there were also areas that were very sharp and very soft within the same picture plane, which most of you that know photography know that's impossible unless you shift the back of your camera a little bit. Or of course in Photoshop we can shift anything we want to. So the video earlier, I used my view camera that now has a digital back attached to it. And if you were to actually, this is a cheating, so it could be in the picture. But I actually have where my camera stand usually stands. And all the people and props have to be on that side of the line so that they're not really in the picture. Distortion change that the sweep on the actual backdrop. Every time usually use anywhere from 10 to 12 little miniature mini spots, they're called. And everything, I'm lucky enough to have a studio that had open rafters, so everything is hanging from monofilament or fishing line from the rafters. You'll also use a lot of stands for the camera. Anything that's sharp in the photograph is close to the backdrop. Anything soft is farther away from the backdrop, and that's how I build depth of field, which doesn't happen on a shadow. If you look at shadows, there's no depth in them, and it's all like magic and mirrors, right? Smoke and mirrors. Let's go forward here. If I can, it's not moving. Okay, I'm pushing the wrong button. There we go. So if we go back and forth just for a minute, this is the set, this is the image. This is the very first one in the series. The beginning of this were these long and narrow images because at some point I knew that I was going to print them on fabric, and it was the limitation of how wide that piece of fabric could get printed. They were actually heat transfers. I'll show you a picture of that process in just a minute. So I was really dictated by that long and narrow shape. So I would spend, I don't know, anywhere from 2 weeks to 2 months on a set, get exactly how I wanted it. At this time, I'm still shooting film, so I'm shooting a lot of Polaroid, getting it how I want it, and then I'd shoot real film, take it to the lab, get it processed, come back. Once I get that I really like, then I'll bring my model into the photograph and stage that person, talk them into, standing or posing a certain way to try to tell a narrative. This is another one. So these first images are they're pretty simple images, and they're actually designed so that when you walk through that space, each image you can see through it, and they react to one another. Can you read those titles, or do you need me to read some of them? Can you read them? Yeah. This is another set. This is probably a little better to see. This is my main stage light. It's always very low, and it's shining on the. These are all the little tiny pin spots that are throwing, different various shadows. This is the image. I'll go back just a little bit. You can see the puppets in there. This is one of very few that don't have real people in them. This is another image. If you're not familiar with a view camera, it has what's called a bag bellows on it, so you can put a wide angle lens on it. These chairs are all hanging from wire. And then this is the image, Yoast with pencil. One thing that I'll say a little bit about the creation of the images is, as I mentioned earlier, I would read through those transcripts looking for either a prop that seemed intriguing to me or a gesture and an emotion that I wanted to portray. And I had in my studio 4 by 8 foot doors on sawhorses, just loaded with props whenever, actually I'm guilty of it today. Whenever I'm driving anywhere in a junk store, I'll pick up, and I always have a flashlight with me, and I'll look to see what might make a cool shadow. And I would just have my studio tables filled with those different objects. So the beginning of this work was really intuitive. I might be working on a phrase, but really I'm just picking up different objects to see what could I throw that might be an interesting shadow. This piece here is the prototype. So at some point I figured out that I wanted to do these 4 by 8 foot panels that you would see through and walk through. Originally they were going to be printed on clear film, then they were going to be printed on vellum. I did a couple tests with them. I didn't like them because it was really brittle, and at some point I figured out that I could do these heat transfers onto chiffon, which seemed really ephemeral and really had this ethereal kind of, really emotional feeling to them. And so on this piece of plexiglass, and I could kneel down at the table and look through them to kind of get a sense of how that was going to react as an installation piece. Especially for those of you students studying art, many of us will take on projects. I could never afford to print all these and then decide if it was going to work because it was very, very costly. At the most, in the very beginning when I planned the installation, I went to the store and I got clear kind of frosted plastic, 4 by 8 sheets of frosted plastic, and I just hung those around in my studio to get a sense of what it might feel like to walk through a space like that. And then as I could afford it, I would begin printing to scale. First we printed little tiny fabric tests, then we printed to scale. So at this point, a lot of people doing installation work, you work out some sort of a prototype so you can kind of figure out what the piece is going to feel like or look like. And then eventually I went and I had these are heat transfers. They were done by a printing company in Dallas. The pieces of film were then scanned. They were shot 4 by 5, put on a big drum scanner, high-res scanner, computer, and then the room that they're printed in, the machine is really finicky, so it had to be in a temperature-controlled room. And then after it gets printed, the files get printed onto these big paper sheets. So this is actually paper that we're seeing right here. The paper gets put onto this machine here that is a heat transfer machine. This is the roll of chiffon that you can see right here. So what's happening is the paper is sandwiching into that chiffon, and because the temperature of that machine is so hot, the vapor, the dye from the paper is actually being transferred onto the fabric itself. These are printed as what we call dye sublimation prints, very different than the kind of printing we do nowadays. Everyone does inkjet printing. Not everybody, but a lot of computer people. So what's happening is then it gets separated, the paper goes in the trash, and then the fabric is the finished piece. This is what it looks like coming off. You can see this is the paper roll here, this is the fabric. And then they were cut with an ordinary heat knife, really, just to finish those edges so we didn't have to put a hem on. But if you take a heat knife and run it across a piece of chiffon, it seals it to a nice, so it doesn't fray. I'm going to show you now, just sort of quickly, I mentioned that there's right now 5 chapters, and I'm just going to show you about 4 or 5 images from each chapter so you can kind of get a sense of the project. In the first project, I think I told you everything here. So Night Interrogations was the beginning of the first chapter. And I also will say, I don't know that these will be the chapters in the book. I'm represented by a few galleries in the United States. In my gallery, I usually have a show about every 3 years. And just for the sake of breaking it into years, I would give each one a new chapter. So that's sort of how and Night Interrogations was really what the beginning of the project was. So here we have the actual installation itself, and as 8-foot panels, and you can round. It's designed much like a maze. When you walk into it, you can't see your way out until you kind of move around to a different corner, and that's really important to me as I lay out every time it gets shown in another place. I wanted it to be a maze so that you felt like you were actually in that dream space, experienced that space of the unconscious or subconscious. And then this is a detail, this is a close-up of it. And one of the things that was a really happy accident is that I thought when I designed it, you saw that little prototype, I thought that we would see through the clear areas, the light areas. And what happened is the black shadow became the transparency material. So it was a really happy accident. Also, with the way that fabric works, when you walked right up to it, you couldn't see the image at all. You'd see through the image. And when you walked to the side of it, the whole thing would light up, which is much like the dream. The dream comes and goes, and it's gone really fast. I'm going to play, I have to walk over here. I mentioned, or maybe I didn't mention, but when you walk into this installation piece, there's a soundtrack. There's 2 simultaneous soundtracks that ricochet off of each other. And there are recordings that I did in a sound booth. And I took the actual phrases that I pulled from those transcripts, and I recited them as a series of whispers. And you only get to hear one track, but you can imagine when you're standing there, you might hear one whisper, then another whisper on the other side, and another one on the other side. I just recorded a couple of these for you to hear. So imagine you're in this pitch black space and you're hearing these whispers. There wouldn't be this space in between them. And then I'll just show you one more. And here's another detail. You can start to see how you can see this other image through the first image. So within that space, there's what sounds like normal audio voice and then whispering voice. And eventually those voices just start ricocheting back and forth in the gallery space. And actually that was the last detail. So chapter 2, at some point I decided that the installation piece was really finished, and I wanted to start doing single images now. And so chapter 2 includes early print works created as single narratives. In the beginning stages, that whole big project that I just showed you had to do with this notion of one image working off of another. In this work and all the current work that I'm doing, I think of one image as a single story or a single narrative. The shadow throughout the series implies a sense of reality without being real. It allows fabrication of a world and a narrative that occurs only in the photograph. The scenarios and spaces portrayed are surrogates for what once was and what is now imagined. This is the scale, so you can get a sense of what those prints look like. Actually, there's no person there, but they're 35 by 47, so they're quite large prints. And then these are some of the images. I'm going to show you about 4 or 5 from each chapter. This is called What's Being Offered. And I'm working sort of the same way, only now you can see that the images are getting much more complicated. I'm really much more interested in what kind of a story can I tell. And I've always been interested as an artist in telling a story that has an unanswered question. My work is all about theater, drama, mystery. She's grasping her behavior. Many of the titles are phrases from the actual transcripts. Waiting for the exact moment to respond. Oftentimes you can't tell if the character is male or female. Anything air is usually not real. Something needs constant attention is the title. Unconscious memory was the next sort of 3 years of work. Chapter 3 conjures up childhood imaginings, fairy tales, and nightmares alike, and makes conscious, lost, and forgotten fragments of experience and emotion. I'm starting to think more in these images about this notion of the fairy tale and the nightmare. Using mythic characters and incongruous objects, this chapter delves into the fantastic and seduces the viewer with unmoored phantom-like tableaus. You might be able to tell some of my favorite childhood heroes were Rod Serling, The Twilight Zone, and Alfred Hitchcock. Idle curiosity. The other thing, I mean, I don't always give away all of this, but because there's so many students here, and I think you're all learning how the artist works, how do we make work. I'll tell you that I mentioned anything close to the background is sharp, anything far from the background is soft. And because they're so far away from the backdrop, the way the light's hitting on them, these are mannequins that are hanging in the air. This bowl is probably 10 feet in front of where this little mannequin is. So it's all built in the studio as I keep shooting more and more Polaroid till I sort of get it how I want it to look. Does that make sense? It's titled "We Found Each Other's Secret Place." Notice here in this body of work now I'm starting to really bring in this notion of the foreground. I'm perfecting sort of the craft of how I can make that look much more dimensional. And I'm starting now, that little set that you saw on this side, these foregrounds are all shot with about 10 or 11 more spotlights that are throwing a totally different shadow over here. Like it's the same shadow. There's no way that a shadow could be thrown like that from one direction. Sex is interrupted. Some of you know my husband Richard, that's him, the star character. I know this was in the video, but I thought I'd show it to you again and talk to you just a little bit about the process here. So here we have, that's actually Richard again, my model. And so what will happen is I mentioned I work on the sets and then I bring the models in and I'll shoot a whole bunch of Polaroids like I mentioned earlier. And then I'll lay all the Polaroids out. Usually maybe I'll shoot 10 or 20 Polaroids. And we'll just look at all the Polaroids and then I'll choose one. I'll say, okay, this is really where I want to go with this image. I'll bring out my film, real film, I call it, and then try to direct them back into what that scene looked like. And I really am a director, like a movie director. I control everything to how they stand. And you can imagine, because that sweep is so severe, they can't stand and see themselves, nor can they stand in a normal position or it wouldn't look real. So they're really very distorted, and I have to sort of talk them into it. And I use a little red pointer, move your arm here, stand here, move your leg there, etc. Everyone asks about that black tape on her dress. The dress was way too big for her, so we just gaff taped it so it would fit. And then here's the finished image. See, seizing comfort. This was based on this whole notion of this big wind coming in and blowing this house, these two displaced figures. There's a separate stick that's hung in the backdrop. Ones that are really close to the backdrop. The ones that look like they're part of the same stick, like maybe that one, is probably 10 feet to the front of it, just to make it look like it's dimensional. In my studio, which you saw, there's about a 25-foot from the light, 25-foot space from the light to the actual backdrop itself. Visions of an Insomniac was between 2007 and 2009. In 2006, I was in a severe bicycle accident and I broke my shoulder in 2 places and I couldn't work for a year. And when my husband could take me somewhere for the first time, he took me to Cirque du Soleil. And when I first started making images again, all of the work had to do something with the circus, the flying. I made these beautiful little headdresses for almost every model. So you'll see, I'm just mentioning that because you'll kind of see it in there. Chapter 4 explores the space between illusion and reality and includes images juxtaposed with psychoacoustic sound and cast shadows. These juxtapositions forge a relationship between visual and oral perception. The narratives combined with lighting techniques create a sense of surprise and wonder and deviate from the earlier work by bringing actual shadows and sound to life within the confines of the gallery space. I worked with a sound artist. We got a joint collaborative grant, and she did a series of sound pieces. And I'm not going to play that to you because it was just too hard to combine. But she did these sound pieces based on the images. So here you can see the actual installation. I did 2 different installations. My most recent one also was even more shadows. Here, mesh screen shadows on the floor and on the wall. And then there was a soundtrack that was actually within the gallery when you walked in. These are some of the pieces, as Richard again, Magic Stories. You can see a lot more of that background. And I'll tell you my secret, all the little dots are a disco ball. And to tell you the truth, I could use a disco ball in every shot, but I know I can't. It's really fun. This is called Balance. This is titled Thorn Girl. The headdresses that I really took great fun in using these different animals and making them look like other animals with tinfoil and feathers and different kinds of fabrics. This is titled Plunge. I sort of love playing with emotions within an image. I'm not sure when I look at this image if you're supposed to feel sad or if you're supposed to feel liberated. And I like sort of that ambiguity that I can set up with an emotional space. Here's another another set. And I have a wooden doll with a little mannequin on top. We're standing up on this platform in order to build the props, build the set. Here's the finished image. So sometimes I'm using mannequins. Oftentimes I'll put a mannequin in there as a stand place in order to build the set. And then sometimes the set takes so long, I end up falling in love with the mannequin. I don't ever bring the real child in. And then other times I'll purposely leave a space for a real person and then leave the mannequin. So there's a combination. Theatrical Realms of the Whimsical and Tragic is the last chapter, second to the last chapter. Chapter 5 provides visitors entry into imaginary worlds of whimsical creations that at times portray life on the lyrical and playful edge of balance and stability. The images suggest a theatrical world that references the ridiculous, the tragic, and the unexpected. Details represent and portray familiar objects that float in and out of the dream state, while a video component brings fragments of the dreams and memory back to life. So within this body of work, you can see I'm playing some more with the shadows. And this time, in this kind of 3-year period, every time I would shoot an image in the studio, I also would shoot animated shadows. So I began really collecting a lot of different moving shadows. And especially on these sets, after I would get the set finished, I would put a fan on it or have someone walk through it in order to make it move. And my vision, and I'll show it to you at the end, my vision was that you would come into the space and see these photographic prints, but then there would be a motion piece that would actually bring that back to life. And to me, the analogy had to do with this notion of when you remember a dream, every time you remember it, something else gets added, or you remember it a different way, or you might be walking down the street and the car goes by and suddenly the wheels on the car remind you of that dream you had last night, but you didn't remember it until then. So I wanted to sort of recreate that sense of seeing the images, but then seeing these little fragments from those same images in the video piece. I also began doing a whole series of images that I call the objects within our dreams. When I look back at those transcripts, sometimes the descriptions read like I only describe an object. Other times I describe a large panorama of a narrative. So this show actually had one where the objects. You can see the wall to the side within the gallery painted black. These are some of the images. Oh, we got a shadow of a fly. How nice. We need a video of that. Disrupted Equilibrium is the title of this one. What I would say about this last work is the sets are very, very, very complicated. Shapes are on different scales, and it takes me crazy, like a couple of months to get the sets right. Amelia's Phantom, this was the image that was being shot when we did the product endorsements. You can kind of see it finished. The Bird Collector. So I'm moving and changing, holding sticks that are at totally the wrong angle to make it look like this shadow direction. I like this notion, the bird collector outside of the cage. That's really, I like throwing those kind of ambiguity in there. This is Encrypted Lessons. It's my homage to living in Texas, cowgirl. And then these, I'll show you just a few of these. These are the object pieces. They're on a smaller, I should say that they're not that small. It's a 30 by 40 set, but they're smaller objects. But again, sense a dimension in them. This is titled Safe House. It's titled Nightingale. This is titled Poetic Wisdom. Twilight Chi. This is the only one that's me, and I actually changed the profile so it wouldn't look exactly like me. I also, in my classes, we've talked a lot about happy accidents, and this was one of those ones that was really a happy accident. I was photographing the set, and I turned around, and I always use a cable release, which I have in my hand here, and I wasn't all the way out of the set when I made it, and I ended up really falling in love with that magic. And then I'm going to show you the video piece that, it's a silent piece, so you have to be with your own thoughts. I'll give you a little introduction about it. It's meant to look as though you're observing a sense of reality, and then you go deeper, deeper down into a dream, and then you come back out of the dream, so it begins and ends the same. A lot of this footage was shot in Japan. That's the Japanese characters that you see. The metaphor that I used, I was interested in having that look like as if you were looking out a train window. It was actually a shadow on the ground, on the floor of an elevator that I was going up when I was in Japan. And there was a window every third floor, so that shadow that kept falling on top of it was just the window reflecting onto the floor. That's it.